when it comes to the priorities that we in particular were seeking to elevate at that roundtable, top of the list was very much highlighting that climate action is actually economic reform and that we need a really ambitious 2035 target that sends a strong signal to investors that Australia is serious about its decarbonisation agenda and that we need to prioritise investment in priority projects.
Welcome to The Greener Way. I'm your host, Michelle Baltazar, Executive Director of Media here at FS Sustainability. We are recording on Gadigal land and we pay our respects to the traditional custodians of country and elders past and present. Today's guest is Frankie Muskovic, the newly appointed Executive Director Policy at the Investor Group on Climate Change. Prior to joining IGCC, Frankie was the National Policy Director for the Property Council of Australia, where she led the property industry's national policy and advocacy agenda on sustainability, cities, housing, and regulatory affairs. Also last year, in November, the Australian newspaper recognized her as one of the country's top 100 energy players. So, Frankie, first of all, congratulations and thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Thanks for having me.
Many of our listeners know you from your previous high-profile role at the Property Council of Australia, and specifically your work on energy and climate change policy. But once upon a time, you had dreamt of pursuing a totally different career, and I think I read somewhere that you wanted to design Formula One cars. Can you share a bit about your background, your origin story, if you like, coming out of a multidisciplinary engineering degree to now the epicenter of climate change policy in the country?
Thanks, Michelle. I often reflect on what a strange path it might sound like, starting, from a really technical engineering sort of focused degree at university and then finding myself in the middle of climate policy. And I wish it wasn't such an unusual event, because actually what I think kind of really stoked passion around climate was insight into real world projects that are delivering, in my case, being fresh out of uni, focused on the really burgeoning green building movement that was happening in Australia post the Sydney Olympics, which was actually a really kind of formative time for sustainability policy more broadly across the country. And it spurred the growth of things like Green Star ratings for buildings and, some major commitments from government infrastructure, picking up the, I think, very positive legacy out of the Olympics. And so when I think back to what, year 12, Frankie was excited about, I thought I was going to go to uni, learn how to design race cars because I was a massive Formula One fan. And being Italian background, my family had taken me to the Melbourne Grand Prix a few times over the years, and we were big Ferrari fans. And I thought that's where I was heading. I was going to go. And I actually really enjoyed working on a student-designed race car competition that my uni hosted. And it was amazing because it was giving practical experience to all the theory that I was learning in the engineering world. And I think that kind of, really just sort of getting my hands dirty, understanding what it meant to not just be looking at really cool kind of computer modeling on the screen, in theory, but sort of making it and seeing it in real life was very gratifying. But what really, I think, shifted my focus after having worked, on sustainability projects as an engineering grad out of uni, I took some time off to go traveling, and I spent about 18 months backpacking around the world. And, as it does, travel just changes your perspective on everything. And I spent a lot of time in India in particular, a country I have a lot of love and affection for. And I think when I got home, I was just I had a very different outlook about what I wanted to focus my time on. And because it was, such an interesting time, this was around the Kevin 2007 environment where, if you can believe it, carbon pricing was still a thing and very much kind of on the agenda nationally. But as a young professional, it was intoxicating, and it felt like being able to make a positive contribution to that work was where I wanted to be. And whilst I picked up my more technically focused work, I think when I got back into, and at that time I was working with the Green Building Council of Australia, so I had shifted out of focusing on individual projects and being really interested and sort of satisfied with being able to have an impact, at that level. I very much started to think more at a systems level. I wanted to then, how do I influence the benchmarks by which, all buildings, could be held to a higher standard? And that led me to working with the Green Building Council and pushing their agenda forward. And then that exposed me to the work that governments do. It's like, well, how can I influence not just, the big corporates that care about doing good things? How do I influence, the entire system? And that's where public policy plays a really important role. So even though it looks like maybe a strange set of progressions in terms of career moves, actually every career decision I've made over the last almost 20 years now has been around trying to maximize the impact I can have on climate action. And I felt I was able to make a contribution in my time at the Property Council for the Built Environment. And when the role at IGCC came up, I thought it couldn't be a better time to have an impact more broadly across the economy. Australia's at a really interesting crossroads when it comes to climate action, particularly thinking about how we position, for the future industries that are going to drive economic growth. And I think IGCC and its members are at the very heart of that conversation. So it felt like, an opportunity I couldn't pass up.
IGCC had a seat at the recently concluded roundtable hosted by the Treasurer. What were the key priorities that IGCC brought to the table and why?
It was a really important opportunity, and I'm really so pleased that IGCC had a seat around that table because Rebecca, our CEO, was the voice for climate in that conversation. And I wouldn't certainly underplay the significance of her and our attendance at that roundtable. What comes out of that reform roundtable is very likely to set the government's highest priority legislative and budget agenda for at least this term of Parliament and possibly the next term if they're re-elected in 2028. Australia's sluggish productivity, that's well documented, is really starting to bite in some areas. We've seen structural changes in our economy with the growth of, sort of services industries, really kind of dominating in terms of where employment is concentrated in this country, as well as an aging population. And, alongside those structural challenges is the structural challenge of how we deal with the physical and transition risks of climate change. And we don't yet have, the sort of full systems approach for how we deal with that set of risks, but also opportunities, right? So IGCC's engagement in the roundtable was very much intended to elevate the fact that actually choosing to focus on climate and the opportunities that it presents with having strong ambition baked into the medium-term and long-term targets that we're committed to will unlock more economic opportunity for the country. So we will be economically better off if we are ambitious now and set ourselves up with, clear signals for investment, clear policy support to drive that outcome, than if we kind of muddle through the 2030s and 2040s and, miraculously we're meant to get to net zero by 2050. So when it comes to the priorities that we in particular were seeking to elevate at that roundtable, top of the list was very much highlighting that climate action is actually economic reform. and that we need a really ambitious 2035 target that sends a strong signal to investors that Australia is serious about its decarbonisation agenda, and that we need to prioritise investment in priority projects that will have a longer kind of ramp up when it comes to, things like phasing out of, gas, across the economy where we can electrify. So out of transport, out of buildings, out of parts of industrial processes and things like that. Those things are not going to happen overnight. Those are decisions that need to be made on capital expenditure by hundreds and thousands of businesses around the country. So they need a really strong signal to be able to make those calls, and investors need the strength of that signal to be very strong, because they are investing over the 20, 30-year time horizons, and they need to do that in the best interests of their customers, which are millions of Australians saving for their retirement. So that need for high-level ambition was very much up front, and I think it was very well received and acknowledged that we do not only need the signal for ambition, but we need the practical, actionable plans for how we're going to do that across different economic sectors. So the sector plans that come along with the 2035 target are really key. And the other objectives that we were really seeking to highlight, and again, it was about looking at around the table, where do we see the biggest momentum and support for key pieces of economic reform that's going to underpin that agenda. On one hand, we really wanted to see an enabling environment to price carbon across more of the economy. So along those veins, we were suggesting that the safeguard mechanism is due for review next year. We think it's a very logical opportunity. That expectation is set right now, that when that review happens, the safeguard mechanism is expanded to cover more parts of the economy. So starting to then bake in pricing signals to decarbonise in areas of the economy that aren't currently captured. The Productivity Commission, had similar thoughts as well in their interim net zero report that was published just in the lead up to this reform roundtable, highlighting that there needs to be, an enduring signal on carbon for the electricity sector and the energy sector. Equally, the same applies for heavy vehicles. We have a national fuel efficiency standard that's dealing with passenger and sort of light commercial cars, but nothing at the heavy vehicle end of the spectrum. So we think it was a really logical and good thing to call out that the safeguard mechanism should be expanded. And I think, we're hopeful that will be picked up next year. Another priority that I think that can be viewed as complementary to that is the need to remove distortionary signals that work against, that provide conflicting signals to investors out there in the market. So that means removing fossil fuel subsidies, things like the diesel fuel rebate. That incentive or rebate is working directly against the signal. In particular, mining companies need to start focusing on decarbonisation on site in their operations. We think there's a very clear indication that that's being picked up in the work that's going to be taken forward to review road user charging, which is looking at declining fuel excise receipts. So, the growth of EVs is a good thing, but it is leading to a declining tax base to help fund roads. And so I think it's very likely that we're going to throw a blanket over things like the diesel fuel rebate, declining fuel excise receipts, EV road user charging, maybe even roads funding, and that'll be hived off into a process as well. We also supported the creation of a level playing field for Australian exporters of low carbon goods. So that's the implementation of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And it's really important to think of that as being complementary to the safeguard mechanism expansion and review, because those two things are two great tastes that taste better together. And so if we can implement a CBAM for Australia, it means we can start to remove some of the additional concessions that we've had for trade-exposed baseline adjusted facilities So they're getting, a lot more financial support from the government because they are trade exposed. So if we create that level playing field with a CBAM, then we can direct that funding to go to, early stage investment in what is likely to be, really exciting export opportunities for Australia linked to our abundance of renewable energy resource. So things like green iron exports and things like that. And even SAF, those are growth industries that are going to need, more concentrated government support in the early stages. And so, we think that reform will free up much needed government resources. I think just lastly, what we were really keen to make sure that those other participants at the roundtable heard was that we really feel that if Australia is indeed fortunate enough to host COP31 next year in Adelaide, that provides an accelerating environment for all of the things that we're talking about here. So really unlocking partnerships, fast-tracking investment in some of those future growth industries, especially, and not just for Australia domestically, but really a chance for us to play that leadership and coordinating role in our region, because I think we are acknowledging we need to, realise that Australia is a big exporter of fossil fuels currently, but into the future, the demand for those things is going to decline. And our economic opportunity, and sort of trade industries really depend on us diversifying that strategy and looking to what future industries are likely to be. And there's a really nice, huge opportunity and connection with existing trade partners to switch away from fossil fuels and into some of those green commodities for the future.
I feel like that was unfair for me to ask you that question, because there's a lot of things on the agenda, but it's heartening for me, just kind of representing, that person on the street who feels overwhelmed by this problem that we have, that there are solutions, and there's not just one, there are two. And if you do these two, they're complementary. And if you do these three, then suddenly you've got a recipe for a great and very robust strategy to move us towards net zero. We have many listeners who are the fund managers themselves, who do work with IGCC's members, and the financial advisors who are part of the community. What do you hope to bring to your role at IGCC that are perhaps inspired by what you've done at the Property Council?
I think where I felt we had the most impact during my time at the Property Council is where we partnered really thoughtfully and built, strategic alliances with different stakeholder groups. So I'm really interested in getting under the hood with members to understand their priorities, and then I think building coalitions for reform, because we are going to need that broad-based support to get some of the things done that we want to. So I think that's one of the main things I'm really looking forward to doing here.
And how would you've touched on this very briefly before, but how would you describe the policy landscape in Australia compared with the rest of the world? And is the pace of change fast enough?
I mean, there's a lot going on at the moment. And I did sort of suggest before, I think we've been a little hampered, obviously, over the last decade, being in this kind of dichotomy, is it coals or renewables? And the climate policy debate hasn't been much broader than that. So I do think we're playing catch up a bit. The benefits of that, I guess, are that we can, look at jurisdictions that have gone further ahead. I do think Australia's being a constructive and very proactive actor on the international scene. We've led on some of the negotiating streams at the last couple of COPs. So I do think our reputation, is improving, but that needs to be backed up, with credible action, right? So the 2035 target, the sector plans, I think they are the next really important pieces of the puzzle that are going to demonstrate our credibility, in a sort of ongoing way.
And you'll, of course, be involved in the policy-related sessions at the upcoming IGCC conference in Sydney next month in October. We'll share the conference links in our show notes for this episode. But what are the key discussions at the conference that delegates can look forward to that will advance the climate change debate? And I know this is one of those big questions again, but perhaps you can just kind of tease out what they can expect at the conference.
Sure thing. I think because we are in this environment of everything, everywhere, all at once, it's hard to pick favorites from the program because there's a lot to cover. But I think the team's done an amazing job at picking kind of, big, bold thematics to explore. I mean, obviously, I'm really looking forward to hearing the wisdom of Al Gore, who's coming out to speak at the summit. And I think it comes at a really, timely moment. We are looking to step up on the international stage and hope to be hosting a COP in Australia next year. I'm really, really excited to see what advice he's got for us in the room about how we harness that opportunity, and also how we, I think as a country, try and pick what are a couple of, really big ticket items we want to see progress on, leveraging, the opportunity of hosting a big session like that. And I really think our connection and role in sort of the Asia Pacific and working with our Pacific partners is a huge opportunity there.
Anything else you'd like to share with our listeners?
Really just, I think, an ask to get in touch. I think I'm only a few weeks into the role here at IGCC, and there is so much going on. It's going to be a really busy time. I think I'm really, just looking forward to meeting the broader ecosystem and getting to know people in the industry. So, I'd love it if people listening to this wanted to reach out for a chat. I'm really keen to understand where people's priorities are and, ensure that IGCC can continue to be a really strong voice for our industry.
Well, we'll definitely share your contacts in our show notes. Although you are present on LinkedIn, you're present on social media. And by the way, if you want to learn more about the latest developments, all these reports coming out on climate and energy, Frankie is a co-host of a fortnightly podcast called the Let Me Sum Up podcast. We'll also share the link. So that is a great listen. I enjoyed listening to the latest episode that came out. But Frankie, I hope we can do a part 2 6 months on from joining IGCC and maybe give me an update then. Once again, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Michelle.
This is The Greener Way. I'm your host, Michelle Baltazar. Thank you for listening.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement, and if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.